Tranquility of Puerto Vallarta, Mexico was shattered by gunfire and arson as members of a drug cartel reacted violently to the killing of their leader by federal authorities. Flights into the resort city were canceled or turned around in midair to avoid the conflict, and tourists already there holed up inside their hotel rooms. Our Truth and Politics panel is here to shed some light on the effects of these events. With us, as always, are Jennifer Laewetz, the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair, a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Thanks to you both as always. Niigaan, let's start with you. There was violence in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. What comes to mind when you see and hear all of these news reports of a gang leader killed by police and the ensuing gun battles? What else do you see?
So the gang leader that was killed was in charge of what's called the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or the JNGC. Now, what people may not know is that the JNGC has been terrorizing and murdering Indigenous peoples for years. The Niigaan people, the Wixárika people, the Mexican people, the Odam people. Oftentimes these cartels are in the forests. They're in the sort of rural areas. Many of those is farmlands or traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. And what happens is those Indigenous peoples are caught in the crossfires of what is often a big conflict between the state and the cartels. And in this case, this cartel in particular has been particularly nasty, even attaching explosives to young children to test them before using them on the army. And on top of that, of course, there's the Mexican government, which continues to build resource development projects that impact Indigenous peoples as well. Indigenous leaders are regularly found murdered in Mexico. And so as we are thinking about our relatives, those snowbirds that go down to Mexico for vacations, I just hope that you know that this is an everyday occurrence for Indigenous peoples to experience violence from the cartel.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, Jennifer, you know, we all know that the methamphetamine and fentanyl, cocaine and crack cocaine, they're inundating our communities with addiction and overdoses and even murders. Is it much of a stretch to connect our violence, our drug-fueled loss of life up here, with what is happening in Mexico and South America?
I think it's kind of hard for us to connect it in a way that we don't feel that, very big, heavy drug cartel violence in our streets as much as you would in a place like Mexico. Obviously, what we're seeing happen there right now kind of creates a lot of uncertainty, especially for tourists. And that's where I feel the direct connection is. It's obviously not a place that I want to visit right now because it doesn't feel safe. But we feel the direct effects of what large-scale organized crime, especially drug dealing, looks like on the ground. There is obviously big shipments and movements of drugs happening every single day, and that's the really high level piece. But what happens on the ground, especially in our communities, is the suffering and the loss and the struggle and the breakdown of family and everything that happens because of drug use. And so I feel like personally that's what I feel more of, is I don't see the high level organized crime. I see the direct result of that and how this is a large scale business for a lot of these really bad people. But on the ground, we're left with the effects of that. And I think it's getting worse. And I think it's going to continue getting worse until we start, cracking down on it and figuring out every different angle of how it's coming into the country. And also on the other end of things, putting in every resource that we have to addressing the addiction crisis.
Mm-hmm. And Niigaan, I guess your take on that. What do you think? Is there a connection to both?
Undoubtedly, we are living in communities that are in the echoes and the throes and the residues of residential schools, of the issues of longstanding poverty, which lead to health crises, and the way that people most oftentimes deal with health crises, mental health crisis in particular, is to self-medicate, to use drugs to try to escape. I never fault someone for using drugs or alcohol. I certainly understand it. What we need to provide is better options for individuals who are going through experiences of trauma and experiencing those traumas often on a lifelong basis. And so the problem, of course, is that the drug trade is a very profitable trade. It's oftentimes ostracized. It's not often even taxed. And so what ends up happening is that it's kind of in the depths, in the dark alleys, and the small corners of society. And those are often the small corners where many of our people end up. And so in those places, we need to make sure that there's better offerings for our peoples instead of facing turning to drugs. And that means that we have to give better what's often called wraparound support. So we have to give people options. We have to give them hope. We have to give them opportunity to learn language and culture. Language and culture is always the key to be able to deal with the long-standing traumas which lead to addiction. And our languages, our cultures, the rebuilding of our nations will always be the methods in which our peoples will become the strongest and most full, robust people that we can become. So we really have to build all of those systems up, and we have to at the same time control these incoming drugs from places like Mexico, but then also from the United States as well.
And I guess, Jennifer, there isn't always easy solutions or whatnot, but what do you think we could do to help the Indigenous people in Mexico in this instance?
Well, that's, a really hard question to answer, because it's always up to whether or not our federal government is willing to essentially give that help. Obviously, that gets into the realm of foreign affairs and policy related to that. I think one thing that we can do is remember that when we are traveling, that we are traveling to places where there is still a lot of corruption in governments. Not saying, I want to be careful what I say in regards to that for, everybody's safety, but it's one of these things that Canadians have to remember, and it's not just immune to like drug cartels that exist in Mexico. It's even so much as Canadians that are traveling to places like Hawaii, especially after natural disasters, where we take in the beautiful parts that these places have to offer. And I think sometimes we forget that there is still very real issues that exist in these places, from poverty and really high level organized crime and all of those things. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind. I would love to visit a place like Hawaii one day, but it's, the Indigenous people to that place often talk about how like the tourism takes away from things like their water resources and everything like that. We have to remember that. And if you are traveling to places that seem very, very cheap, often there is a very cheap labor industry in order to give you that cheap cost to visit those places. So I think we just have to keep reminding ourselves of that and be cautious, be incredibly cautious when you're traveling. If the federal government is giving you warnings, it's not normally just to scare you. It's so that they can prevent, us getting stuck in places like this and them having to intervene. So
absolutely, some good points there. I just want to thank you both today for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.